I mean, is Game Freak even able to make games? Because we haven't seen a decent one in decades, probably. Yeah, I'm talking about that Game Freak, the developers of the Pokémon.
Yeah, I recorded this before Pokopia came out.
But we're not here to judge, so let's step back for a second and let's see how this indie story started.
Picture a kid running through tall grass in the suburbs of Tokyo, holding a small jar, trying to catch a beetle before it disappears under a rock. Not exactly the origin story you expect for one of the biggest video game franchises in history, right? But that kid grew up to create Pokémon. And the weird part is that the idea behind Pokémon did not start with game design, technology, or market research. It started with insects. Today, we are going to look at the strange journey of Game Freak, the studio behind Pokémon. From a homemade magazine about arcade games to one of the most powerful franchises in gaming history. And here is the twist. The same studio that created Pokémon is now constantly criticized for being technically behind modern game development. So, the real question is this: is Game Freak falling behind the industry, or is the industry asking them to do something almost impossible? Let's start at the very beginning. Satoshi Tajiri grew up in the suburbs of Tokyo during the 1970s. At that time, the area still had a lot of parks and fields, which meant one thing for a curious kid: bugs. Lots of bugs. Tajiri became completely obsessed with collecting insects. He would spend hours in the grass searching for rare beetles, keeping them in jars, studying them, comparing them with his friends. His classmates noticed this obsession and gave him a nickname that would follow him for years. They called him Dr. Bug. Actually, some say Mr. Bug, some say Dr. Bug. I'll go with Dr. Bug because first, I like it more, and second, it seems consistently confirmed across all sources.
This is the exact park where Satoshi Tajiri, the founder of Game Freak, used to collect insects during his childhood. Just kidding, this is a random park in Osaka.
Now, here is the interesting part. That childhood hobby later became the core game design idea behind Pokémon. Catching creatures, collecting them, comparing them with friends, trading them. That entire loop came from kids showing each other bugs in jars. But before Pokémon existed, Tajiri discovered something else that completely took over his life: arcade machines. Instead of going to school sometimes, Tajiri would spend entire days in arcade game rooms. During the late 70s, arcades were exploding in Japan. And for a curious teenager, it was like stepping into another universe. One game in particular changed everything for him: Space Invaders. The game, released in 1978, became a massive phenomenon. Tajiri played it so much that something very unusual happened. The manager of his favorite arcade eventually gave him the entire cabinet. Yes, the whole machine. Imagine being a teenager and suddenly having a Space Invaders arcade cabinet at home. That kind of experience tends to push you in a certain direction in life. But the arcades also gave Tajiri something even more important than inspiration. They gave him a collaborator. His name was Ken Sugimori. Ken Sugimori was an artist. Tajiri was obsessed with games and game mechanics. The two became close friends while hanging around arcades. This combination ended up becoming one of the most important creative partnerships in gaming history. In 1982, Tajiri decided to start something ambitious. Not a game studio, at least not yet, a magazine. The magazine was called Game Freak. It was an amateur publication where Tajiri wrote detailed reviews and analysis of arcade games. Kind of what I'm doing today with this channel. At that time, game journalism looked very different from today. These magazines were often created by enthusiasts who were deeply involved in the arcade scene. Sugimori joined the project as the art director, drawing illustrations and layouts for the magazine. So, this is a fun detail that many people forget. Game Freak was not originally a game studio. It was literally a fan magazine. During this time, Tajiri became extremely knowledgeable about games, especially the Nintendo Famicom, which was released in Japan in 1983. Because of his work writing about games, he played an enormous number of titles, studying their mechanics and design. Eventually, he noticed something that bothered him. Many Famicom games were simply not very good. The design felt repetitive. The ideas were often shallow, and Tajiri believed he could do better. So, he made the decision that many indie developers will recognize immediately. If the games are bad, make one yourself. During the mid-80s, Tajiri and Sugimori decided to try creating a video game. They programmed it using BASIC on Nintendo Entertainment System. He actually used BASIC to learn, but the game itself was probably not programmed in BASIC. He built custom hardware and tools. The game, published in 1989, was called Quinty. In the West, it was later released as Mendel Palace. The game was eventually shown to Namco, which saw potential in the project and decided to publish it. The title was released in 1989. This moment completely changed the trajectory of Game Freak. About 5 years after the magazine was created, Game Freak officially transformed into a video game development company. The transition alone is already a fascinating story for indie developers today. A small group of enthusiasts writing about games slowly becomes a real studio making them. And they did not stop at one project. Game Freak started collaborating with Nintendo on several titles, including Mario, Yoshi and Mario, and Wario. Later, they also developed Postman, an action platformer for the Sega Mega Drive released in 1994. And here is something that indie developers might appreciate. At this stage, Game Freak was still a relatively small studio experimenting with ideas, tools, and workflows. They were not a giant company with thousands of employees. They were closer to a scrappy indie team. But around the early 90s, Tajiri had an idea that would completely change everything. Remember the kid catching insects in the jar? That memory came back years later when Tajiri saw something interesting about the Game Boy. The Game Boy had a cable called Game Link. This cable allowed two handheld consoles to connect together. For most developers at the time, this was just a technical feature. For Tajiri, it was a design opportunity. He imagined kids connecting their Game Boys and exchanging creatures they had collected in the game, just like he and his friends used to compare insects. This was the core idea. Catch creatures, train them, trade them with friends, battle other players. The design was brilliant because it turned a single-player game into a social experience. To complete the game 100%, you had to interact with other players. You literally needed other people. This mechanic forced communication between players long before online multiplayer became common. From a game design perspective, this is extremely clever. It created what designers today would call a social dependency loop. You cannot complete the collection alone. You need the community. And if you are an indie developer, you can probably see how powerful that design is. It creates organic player interaction without requiring massive server infrastructure. Just a cable. The Pokémon idea was not easy to sell. Developing the game actually took more than 5 years, about 6. The project struggled with technical issues, financial pressure, and development delays. At one point, Game Freak almost ran out of money, but someone inside Nintendo believed strongly in the project. Shigeru Miyamoto. Yes, the same Shigeru Miyamoto behind Super Mario, Donkey Kong, and The Legend of Zelda. Miyamoto supported Tajiri's concept and helped push the project forward inside Nintendo. Without that support, Pokémon might never have been finished. This slightly overstates his role. Shigeru Miyamoto began to mentor Tajiri, this is true, guiding him during the creation process. But it seems that he was just a mentor, not someone who saved the project from cancellation. In 1996, Nintendo released Pocket Monsters Aka and Pocket Monsters Midori in Japan. In English, we know them as Pokémon Red and Pokémon Green. What happened next was something nobody expected. The games slowly started gaining popularity through word of mouth. Kids were trading monsters, discovering secrets, and talking about the game everywhere. Then the franchise exploded. Video games became anime, trading cards, movies, toys, and one of the largest entertainment franchises in the world. According to franchise revenue estimates compiled by multiple industry reports, Pokémon is one of the highest grossing media franchises ever created. Not bad for a kid who liked collecting beetles. But now, we need to talk about the part that Pokémon fans may not like. Because the same studio that created this phenomenon is constantly criticized today. If you follow Pokémon releases, you probably know what I'm talking about. Every new Pokémon game launches and the internet explodes with the same discussion. Why do these games look technically behind other Nintendo titles? Compared to games like The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, or Super Mario Odyssey, Pokémon sometimes appears visually simpler, with performance issues or less complex environments. So, here's the simple question. Is Game Freak behind the industry? Is it because the studio simply does not have the technical skills to keep up with modern development? Or maybe the problem is not talent, it is scale and production pressure. Game Freak is responsible for the core Pokémon games, but Pokémon itself is a massive multimedia ecosystem. Games, anime seasons, trading cards, merchandise, movies, everything is connected to release schedules, which means the game studio often has strict deadlines tied to the rest of the franchise. And if you're a developer, you know exactly what that means. So, the debate becomes more complicated. Is Game Freak technically behind, or are they trying to ship massive RPGs under extremely tight timelines? There is also another factor many people overlook. Game Freak is still relatively small compared to other AAA studios. Public estimates suggest that the company has about 200 employees. For comparison, many modern open-world games involve thousands of developers across multiple studios. So, the real question becomes interesting. Are we expecting a mid-sized studio to compete with gigantic AAA teams while also maintaining one of the biggest franchises in the world? That is not an easy challenge. So, here we are. A company that started as a fan magazine eventually created one of the most influential game franchises ever. But the story is still evolving. Game Freak continues to develop Pokémon games today, while also experimenting with new projects and ideas. And the debate around their technology, production timelines, and creative direction is probably not going away anytime soon. But if you step back and look at the entire journey, it is honestly kind of amazing. A kid collecting insects in a park accidentally invented one of the most successful game concepts in history. If you made it this far, I'm curious what you think. Is Game Freak actually behind modern game development? Or are they just stuck in an impossible production cycle because Pokémon is too big now? Let me know what you think in the comments. And like always, thanks for watching.